Imagine being surrounded by police officers while you're completely unable to explain what's happening. You're on the ground, your body is shaking, you can't answer questions, you can't follow commands, and instead of immediately recognizing that something may be medically wrong, officers treat your movements as resistance. Then the situation gets worse. What happens next can turn a routine police encounter into something far more serious, including a lawsuit, and that's exactly why situations involving a person experiencing a seizure are so important to understand. Because when someone is having a medical emergency, the person may not be capable of doing the one thing officers are usually demanding, cooperating, and that distinction can become critical. Let's walk through what can happen when police misinterpret a medical emergency as defiance, and where the legal line may be drawn. Picture the situation. A person is suddenly in distress. They're confused. Their movements aren't normal. They're unable to communicate clearly. Someone calls 911. Police arrive before the full medical picture is understood. From the officer's perspective, they don't necessarily know what caused the behavior. They may see someone moving unpredictably. They may hear people yelling. They may believe the person is intoxicated, resisting, armed, or otherwise dangerous. And that's where the situation can become extremely dangerous, because police officers are trained to respond to threats. But a medical emergency can sometimes look like a threat. When viewed from the outside, the person may not respond to commands. They may push away without understanding what they're doing. They may fall. They may make movements they cannot control, and they may be physically incapable of explaining themselves. Now imagine an officer interpreting all of that as intentional resistance. That's when a medical emergency can suddenly become a use of force situation, and once force enters the picture, the legal questions become much more complicated. Here's the first thing you need to understand. Police officers do have authority to use force in certain circumstances. The fact that someone is experiencing a medical emergency does not automatically mean every action by an officer is unlawful. Officers still have to make decisions based on the circumstances they reasonably perceive at the time. But that doesn't mean anything an officer does is automatically protected. The circumstances matter. What did the officers know? What could they reasonably see? Did anyone tell them the person was having a medical emergency? How long did the behavior continue? Was the person actually threatening anyone? Was the person restrained? Was additional force used after the threat had changed? And perhaps most importantly, did the officers recognize that they were dealing with a medical crisis? Those questions can become extremely important later. Now let's imagine the moment that changes everything. An officer approaches the person. The officer gives a command. There is no response. Another command. Still no response. The person moves unpredictably. The officer interprets that movement as resistance. The situation escalates, but then someone nearby shouts, "He's having a seizure." Stop right there. That information could fundamentally change how the situation should be understood. The question is no longer simply, why isn't this person obeying? It becomes, is this person physically capable of obeying? That's a completely different question, and that's why witnesses can sometimes become extremely important in police encounters involving medical emergencies. A witness may know something the officers don't. A family member may recognize the symptoms. A bystander may have already called emergency medical services. A person may be wearing medical identification, or officers themselves may observe signs that suggest something other than intentional resistance. The more information available to officers, the more complicated the legal analysis becomes. And this is where many people misunderstand police lawsuits. A lawsuit doesn't simply prove something terrible happened. There are legal standards that have to be met. Depending on the circumstances and the claims involved, a civil rights case may examine whether officers used unreasonable force, whether they failed to respond appropriately to a known medical need, or whether some other constitutional or state law violation occurred. The exact claim matters. The facts matter, the jurisdiction matters, and the evidence matters. Body camera footage can matter enormously. 911 recordings can matter. Witness statements can matter. Medical records can matter. Photographs can matter, and the timeline can matter. Because sometimes the most important question isn't what happened during the first 5 seconds, it's what happened after everyone understood what was happening. Think about that distinction. An officer arrives and doesn't immediately understand that someone is having a medical emergency. That may be one situation. But suppose the officer is clearly told, this person is having a seizure, and suppose medical information is visible, and suppose the person's condition is obvious. Now imagine force continues anyway. That doesn't automatically establish liability, but it creates questions that investigators, attorneys, and eventually a court may have to examine. What did the officer know? When did the officer know it? What did the officer do after learning it? And was the response reasonable under the circumstances? Those questions are far more useful than simply shouting, "The cops were corrupt," because legal cases are decided by evidence, not outrage. Now, let's take this one step further. Imagine the person is eventually taken for medical treatment. Doctors confirm that the person experienced a seizure. Family members begin asking what happened. Someone obtains video, and the video appears to show officers using force while the person was experiencing the medical episode. Now the story changes again. The family may consult an attorney. The attorney may investigate the incident. They may examine medical records. They may request police records. They may review body camera footage. And if the evidence supports a legal claim, litigation can follow. But here's something important. Being sued does not automatically mean the officers are legally guilty. That's a distinction your audience should understand. A lawsuit is an allegation and a legal process. The plaintiff still has to establish the elements of the claim. The officers may raise defenses. The government may argue that the officers acted reasonably. And ultimately, the outcome depends on the facts, applicable law, and court proceedings. That's why responsible legal reporting should never tell viewers, "The lawsuit proves the cops broke the law." It doesn't. The evidence and legal process determine that. But there's another lesson here that ordinary drivers and families should remember. If someone you know experiences a medical emergency during a police encounter, don't assume the officers automatically understand what's happening. If it is safe to communicate, clearly explain the medical condition. Don't physically interfere with officers. Don't turn a medical emergency into a second confrontation. Instead, communicate the critical information as clearly as possible. For example, "Officer, this person is having a medical emergency. Please call EMS." That's very different from screaming insults or threatening the officers. The goal is to get the medical information across. And if you are a witness, remember what you actually observed. Don't exaggerate. Don't fill in gaps. Don't guess about what the officer was thinking. Document what you know. Because later, the difference between what you saw and what you assumed can become extremely important. Now here's the part that makes these cases so difficult. Police officers sometimes have seconds to make decisions. A person on the ground may genuinely look dangerous. An officer may not know whether the person is experiencing a seizure, intoxication, mental health crisis, or something else. That uncertainty matters. But uncertainty isn't the end of the analysis. The question can also become whether the officers adjusted their response as additional information became available. That's where the timeline becomes critical. What did they know at the beginning? What did they know 30 seconds later? What did they know after witnesses explained the situation? What did they know after medical personnel arrived? Every one of those moments can change the analysis. And there's a bigger lesson here about police encounters generally. When officers encounter someone who isn't responding normally, the behavior shouldn't automatically be interpreted through only one lens. Not every unusual movement means resistance. Not every failure to answer means defiance. Not every person who appears confused is intentionally refusing to cooperate. Sometimes there's something else happening, and recognizing that possibility can be the difference between de-escalation and escalation. So let's return to the title. Cops attacked a man during a seizure, now they're being sued. The most important question isn't simply whether the officers were good or bad. The real questions are, what did they know? What could they reasonably perceive? What force did they use? Was the person actually threatening anyone? When did officers learn about the medical emergency? And what did they do after they knew? Those are the questions that turn an emotional story into a legal analysis. And if a lawsuit follows, those facts can become the foundation of the entire case. There's also a lesson here for anyone watching. If you ever see someone experiencing what appears to be a medical emergency during a police encounter, your instinct may be to rush in and physically intervene. Be extremely careful. You don't want to create another confrontation or put yourself in danger. If possible, communicate the medical information clearly and request emergency medical assistance. And if you later become a witness, write down what you personally saw while the details are still fresh. Don't turn your memory into a story. Keep it factual. Because video, timestamps, medical records, dispatch recordings, and eyewitness accounts can become much more valuable than dramatic claims made afterward. The most disturbing part of these situations isn't always the first mistake. Sometimes it's what happens after the mistake should have been obvious. A Person who appears to be resisting may actually be unable to respond. A movement that looks aggressive may be involuntary. A failure to follow a command may have a medical explanation. And once that explanation becomes known, the response may need to change. That's why every police encounter involving a medical emergency deserves careful examination rather than an instant assumption about who was right. If the evidence shows that officers crossed the legal line, there can be consequences. Those consequences can include internal investigations, discipline, civil litigation, and potentially other legal proceedings depending on the facts. But the evidence has to establish what actually happened. So if you remember only one thing from this story, remember this: a medical emergency can completely change the legal context of a police encounter. What looks like resistance from a distance may not be resistance at all. And when police are told that someone is experiencing a medical emergency, what happens next can become just as important as what happened when officers first arrived. That's why body camera footage, witness statements, medical evidence, and the exact timeline matter so much. Because when the facts are clear, the legal system has something concrete to examine. And when the facts aren't clear, that's exactly why people should avoid turning a complicated encounter into a simple story of heroes and villains. The evidence comes first. If you want more real-world police encounters broken down without the fake legal myths and exaggerated claims, subscribe. Because the next time a routine police encounter suddenly turns into something much more serious, understanding what actually matters can make all the difference.